In the autumn of 891 AD, when the rains came heavy and the Dyle River swelled beyond its banks, a Frankish king named Arnulf led his army through the mud and marshland of the Low Countries to face the most feared warriors in Christendom, and our silver-armored GoodKnight marched with him into a battle that would turn a river black with blood and corpses. The Vikings had fortified themselves on an island in the swollen Dyle near Leuven, their longships pulled up on the banks, their treasure hoarded behind wooden ramparts, their two kings, Siegfried and Gottfried, confident that no Christian army would dare assault their stronghold through the rising waters and treacherous swamp. But Arnulf was not like the emperors who had come before him, the ones who paid silver to buy peace. He was a warrior king who understood that legitimacy came not from bloodline but from victory, and he would give his men an order that day that defied every tradition of Frankish warfare, an order that would save his army and doom the Northmen to a watery grave. Watch as our GoodKnight dismounts from his warhorse and transforms from mounted knight to heavy infantryman, as he wades through knee-deep mud in 40 pounds of iron mail, as he storms the Viking ramparts in a grinding, brutal melee where superior armor and discipline clash against ferocity and desperation, and as he stands on the riverbank afterward, bloodied and shaken, watching thousands of Vikings drown in the very waters they thought would protect them. So many dead that the chroniclers would write that their bodies blocked the flow of the river itself. This is the story of the Battle of the Dyle, where a single tactical decision turned a natural fortress into a death trap, where the great army that had terrorized Europe for decades was shattered in a single afternoon, and where our GoodKnight learned that victory can be more haunting than defeat. Subscribe to the GoodKnight stories for more immersive journeys through history's most pivotal battles, where our eternal warrior in silver armor walks beside you through the mud, blood, and glory of the medieval world, with storytelling designed for deep focus, relaxation, or peaceful sleep. Comment below which forgotten battle you'd like the GoodKnight to witness next. But for now, settle in, relax, and journey back to that rain-soaked September day in 891, when the fate of the Low Countries was decided in the marshes of Leuven. Chapter 1. The Weight of Iron. The GoodKnight had been riding for 3 days. His warhorse, a grey destrier named Ash, bred in the stables of Bavaria, moved with the steady, patient gait of an animal that understood the rhythm of campaign. Beneath the GoodKnight, the saddle creaked with the weight of his armor. 40 pounds of riveted iron rings, each one hammered and linked by a smith in Regensburg, covered his torso from neck to mid-thigh. The byrnie, the mail coat, was a second skin now, after years of wearing it. He no longer noticed the way it pulled at his shoulders or the way the rings pinched the padded gambeson beneath when he moved wrong. But he noticed the weather. The sky over the Low Countries was the color of old iron, heavy and low, pressing down on the column of men and horses that stretched behind him for nearly a mile. It had rained the night before, a cold, persistent rain that soaked through cloaks and turned the road into a ribbon of sucking mud. The GoodKnight's cloak, dyed a deep red and pinned at his shoulder with a bronze brooch, hung heavy with water. Droplets ran down the nasal guard of his helmet and dripped onto his gloved hands, which rested on the pommel of his saddle. September in Brabant. The harvest month. The fields they passed should have been full of peasants cutting wheat and barley, but instead they saw only burned villages and empty granaries. The Vikings had been here. The GoodKnight had fought the Northmen before, twice on the Seine, once near Cologne. He knew their tactics, their weapons, their ferocity. They were not the disorganized raiders of his grandfather's time. These were professional soldiers, men who had spent their entire adult lives at war, who had conquered kingdoms in England and established fortified camps across the Frankish heartland. They were the Great Army, and they had made the rivers of Europe their highways. Ahead, the column slowed. The good knight could see the royal standard as golden eagle on a field of blue, dipping and rising as King Arnulf's horse navigated a particularly deep stretch of mud. The king was riding near the front, as he always did. Arnulf was not a man who led from the rear. He was illegitimate, the bastard son of King Carloman, and he had taken the throne of East Francia through a combination of military skill and political ruthlessness. The nobles followed him not because of his blood, but because he won, and because he paid well. The good knight had sworn his oath to Arnulf 3 years ago, kneeling in the great hall at Regensburg, his hands clasped between the king's hands, the words of vassalage spoken in the old Frankish tongue. In return, Arnulf had granted him a benefice, a small estate near the Danube, with 20 families of serfs and enough income to maintain his war horse, his armor, and his weapons. It was a good life, for a man whose only skill was war, but it required him to answer the summons when the king called. And Arnulf had called in late August, sending riders across Bavaria and Franconia with orders to muster at Aachen. The message was simple. The Northmen have fortified themselves at Leuven. We march to destroy them. The good knight had left his estate in the hands of his steward, kissed his wife, a quiet woman from a minor noble family, and ridden west with his armor, his weapons, and 3 spare horses. He had joined the column at Aachen, falling in with the other Skara, the elite household troops who formed the core of the Frankish army. There were perhaps 300 of them, men like him, professional warriors bound to the king by oaths and silver. Behind them came the levies, farmers and craftsmen from the tribal duchies, men who owed 40 days of military service each year, armed with spears and shields and little else. They were brave enough, but they were not soldiers. In a pitched battle, they would hold the line if the Skara held first. If the elite broke, the levies would scatter. Like leaves, the good knight did not intend to break. The column reached a small rise, and the good knight could see the land ahead. The road descended into a wide, flat valley, and through the mist and drizzle he could make out the dark line of a river, the Dyle. It wound through the landscape like a serpent, its banks swollen with the recent rains. Beyond the river, perhaps 2 miles distant, he could see smoke rising, thin columns of grey against the grey sky. Leuven. The Viking camp. The good knight felt his heartbeat quicken, just slightly. Not fear. He had been in too many battles to feel fear in the hours before combat. But anticipation. The tightening of the chest, the sharpening of the senses. His hand moved unconsciously to the hilt of his sword, checking that it was loose in its scabbard. A horn sounded from the front of the column, 3 short blasts. The signal to halt. The good knight reined in ash, and the destrier stopped obediently, shaking his head and snorting. Around him, the other riders of the Skara were doing the same, their horses forming a loose cluster on the muddy road. The levies behind them shuffled to a stop, their spear points bristling like a forest of iron. A rider was approaching from the front, a young man in a mail coat, wearing the colours of the king's household. He pulled up beside the good knight and the other senior warriors. "The king commands the Skara to advance to the forward position," the rider said, his voice tight with excitement. "He wishes to scout the enemy lines." The good knight nodded. He turned to the men around him, his comrades, men he had fought beside for years, and gestured forward. Without a word, they spurred their horses into motion, moving past the slower levies and up toward the head of the column. As they rode, the good knight studied the terrain. The valley was wide and flat, the kind of ground that should have been perfect for cavalry. But the rains had turned it into something else. The fields on either side of the road were waterlogged, the furrows filled with standing water. In places, the road itself had become a shallow stream. This was not good ground for horses. They reached the front of the column, where King Arnulf sat on his war-horse, surrounded by his personal guard. Arnulf was a man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered and bearded, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from oak. He wore a mail coat similar to the GoodKnight's, but over it he had draped a cloak of deep purple, the imperial colour, a statement of his ambitions. On his head was a simple conical helmet, unadorned except for a cross etched into the nasal guard. Arnulf was staring at the river, his eyes narrowed. The GoodKnight followed his gaze. The Dyle was perhaps 50 yards wide at this point, its waters dark and fast-moving. The rains had swollen it beyond its normal banks, and the floodplain on either side was a morass of mud and reeds. On the far side of the river, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, the GoodKnight could see the Viking camp. It was not what he had expected. The Northmen had not simply pulled their ships onto the bank and pitched tents. They had built a fortress. The camp was situated on what appeared to be an island or a peninsula, a piece of high ground surrounded on 3 sides by the river and on the 4th by a wide expanse of marsh. Around the perimeter, the Vikings had dug a deep ditch and thrown up an earthen rampart, topped with a wooden palisade. The GoodKnight could see the sharpened stakes of the palisade even from this distance, and he could see figures moving along the top, sentries watching the Frankish army assemble. Behind the palisade, he could see the masts of longships, dozens of them, pulled up onto the shore, and beyond the ships, the smoke of cooking fires rose into the grey sky. "They've made themselves a nest," one of the warriors beside the GoodKnight muttered. Arnulf turned in his saddle, his eyes sweeping over the assembled Skara. "I want a closer look," he said. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it, the tone of a man who was calculating odds and angles. 20 men. We ride to the edge of the marsh." The GoodKnight was one of the 20 chosen. He felt a flicker of pride. Arnulf knew his men, knew who could be trusted in a dangerous reconnaissance, but also a flicker of unease. Riding close to a fortified Viking camp was not a task for the faint-hearted. They rode forward in a loose column, leaving the main army behind. The road descended toward the river, and as they drew closer, the GoodKnight could see the full extent of the problem. The marsh was worse than it had looked from a distance. The ground on the approach to the Viking camp was not solid earth, but a treacherous mix of mud, standing water, and hidden sinkholes. The reeds grew thick and tall, and in places the water was knee-deep. The only solid ground was the narrow strip of the road itself, and even that was churned into a quagmire by the passage of the army. Arnulf reined in his horse at the edge of the marsh, perhaps 300 yards from the Viking palisade. The GoodKnight and the others formed a loose semicircle around him, their eyes on the enemy fortifications. For a long moment there was silence, broken only by the sound of the river and the distant cries of waterfowl. The GoodKnight could feel the weight of the Viking sentries' eyes on him. He imagined them up on the ramparts, counting the Frankish riders, assessing their armor and weapons, perhaps laughing at the Christians who had ridden so close. Then, from the Viking camp, a sound rose, a long, mocking shout followed by laughter. The GoodKnight could not make out the words, but the tone was clear. The Northmen were not afraid. One of the Frankish warriors beside the GoodKnight spat into the mud. "They think we won't attack," he said. Arnulf said nothing. He was staring at the camp, his eyes moving methodically from the palisade to the marsh to the river. The GoodKnight could almost see the king's mind working, weighing options, calculating risks. Finally, Arnulf spoke. "We cannot charge them," he said quietly. "Not across this ground. The horses would bog down before we reached the ditch. They would pick us off with arrows and spears, and we would die in the mud like fools." The warriors around him shifted uneasily. The GoodKnight felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. If they could not charge, what could they do? Lay siege? The Vikings had supplies, and their ships gave them a route of escape. A siege could take weeks, and the Frankish army did not have weeks. The levies would begin to desert, and the autumn rains would turn the camp into a disease-ridden swamp. Arnulf turned his horse, his eyes sweeping over the 20 men. "We will attack," he said, "but not on horseback." The good knight felt a jolt of surprise. Not on horseback. The Skara were cavalry. They were bred to fight from the saddle, trained from boyhood to charge with lance and sword. To fight on foot was to fight like a common levy, like a peasant. But Arnulf was not finished. "We will dismount," he said. "All of us. We will advance on foot, in formation, and we will storm the ramparts. Our armor will protect us from their arrows. Our discipline will carry us through the mud. And when we reach the palisade, we will break it, and we will kill them all." The good knight looked at the other warriors. He could see the same mixture of shock and understanding on their faces. It was a radical plan, a plan that defied tradition. But it was also, he realized, the only plan that had a chance of working. Arnulf was watching them, waiting for dissent. None came. "Good," the king said. He turned his horse back toward the main army. "We attack at dawn." Chapter 2. The night before. The Frankish army made camp on the eastern side of the valley, on a low ridge that offered some protection from the wind and a clear view of the Viking fortifications across the marsh. The good knight dismounted and handed Ash's reins to one of the grooms, a boy of perhaps 14, the son of a serf from his estate, who had begged to come on campaign to tend the horses and learn the ways of war. "Rub him down well," the good knight said, "and give him extra oats. He's earned them." The boy nodded eagerly and led the destrier away. The good knight watched him go, then turned his attention to the task of making himself as comfortable as possible for the night. The Skara did not sleep in tents like the levies. They slept in the open, wrapped in their cloaks, their armor still on their bodies. It was a matter of readiness. If the Vikings launched a night raid, there would be no time to don mail and helmet. But it was also a matter of pride. The Skara were hard men, and they did not coddle themselves. The good knight found a relatively dry patch of ground near a cluster of oak trees and spread his cloak on the earth. He sat down heavily, feeling the weight of the day's ride in his legs and back. Around him, the other warriors were doing the same, their movements slow and deliberate. No one spoke much. They were all thinking about the morning. A fire was kindled nearby, and one of the men produced a wineskin. It was passed around the circle, and when it reached the good knight, he took a long pull. The wine was sour and watered, but it was warm, and it took the edge off the cold. "Do you think it will work?" one of the younger warriors asked. His name was Egbert, a Saxon from the north, with a thick blonde beard and a scar across his cheek from a skirmish 2 years ago. "Fighting on foot, I mean." The good knight considered the question. "It will work if we hold the line," he said. "If we stay together, shield to shield, and push forward. The Vikings are fierce, but they are not disciplined. If we break their palisade, they will break." "And if we do not break the palisade?" another man asked. His name was Rathar, a Bavarian like the good knight, older and grizzled, with a limp from an old wound. The good knight met his eyes. "Then we die in the mud, and the king finds another army." Rathar grunted and took another drink from the wineskin. "At least the pay is good," he said, and a few of the men laughed. A short, bitter sound. The good knight did not laugh. He was thinking about the marsh, about the weight of his armor, about the distance from the edge of the solid ground to the Viking palisade. 300 yards, perhaps. More. 300 yards of knee-deep mud and water, with Viking arrows falling like rain. It would be slow, exhausting, and deadly. But Arnulf was right. It was the only way. The fire crackled, and the men fell silent. The good knight lay back on his cloak, staring up at the sky. The clouds had thinned slightly, and he could see a few stars between the gaps, cold, distant points of light. He thought about his wife, about his estate, about the life he would return to if he survived the morning. He thought about the silver he would earn from the plunder of the Viking camp, the land Arnulf might grant him as a reward. And he thought about the men he would kill tomorrow. The Northmen, with their axes and their swords, their braided beards and their heathen gods. He did not hate them, not really. They were warriors, like him, fighting for silver and glory and survival. But they stood between him and his king's victory, and so they would die. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of the camp wash over him, the low murmur of voices, the crackle of fires, the distant whinny of horses. Somewhere in the darkness, a priest was chanting prayers, his voice rising and falling in the old Latin cadences. The good knight did not understand the words, but he found them comforting. God was watching. God would decide who lived and who died. He slept fitfully, waking several times to the sound of rain pattering on his cloak. Each time he checked his weapons, his spear, his sword, his shield, making sure they were within reach. And each time he looked across the valley toward the Viking camp, where the fires burned low and the sentries paced the ramparts. They were waiting too. Dawn came slowly, a gradual lightening of the eastern sky that turned the clouds from black to grey to a pale, sickly yellow. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with mist, and the ground was slick with dew and mud. The good knight woke to the sound of a horn, 3 long blasts, the signal to assemble. He sat up, his body stiff and cold, and reached for his helmet. The conical steel was cold to the touch, and when he settled it on his head, he felt the familiar weight pressing down on his skull, the nasal guard bisecting his vision. Around him, the Skara were rising, checking their gear, tightening the straps of their mail. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The good knight stood and picked up his shield. It was round, made of linden wood, covered in leather, and painted with a simple cross. The iron boss in the center was dented from previous battles, and the rim was reinforced with rawhide. It was a good shield, solid and reliable. He slung it over his left arm and picked up his spear. The spear was his primary weapon. It was 8 feet long, with a leaf-shaped iron head and 2 small wings, lugs, at the base of the blade. The wings prevented the spear from penetrating too deeply into an enemy's body, allowing him to pull it free quickly and strike again. The shaft was ash wood, smooth and well-balanced. He had killed 7 men with this spear, and he intended to kill more today. His sword hung at his left hip, a backup weapon for when the spear broke or the fighting became too close. It was a spata, a straight, double-edged blade nearly 3 feet long, pattern-welded by a master smith in Regensburg. The hilt was wrapped in leather, and the pommel was a simple iron disc. It was not a beautiful weapon, but it was deadly. The good knight joined the other warriors as they formed up in loose ranks. There were perhaps 300 of them, the core of Arnulf's army, the men who would lead the assault. Behind them, the levies were assembling. 2,000 men, armed with spears and shields, their faces pale and nervous. King Arnulf rode along the front of the formation, his purple cloak billowing behind him. He stopped in the center, his horse stamping and snorting, and raised his hand for silence. "Today," Arnulf said, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks, "we will show the Northmen that the Franks do not pay tribute. We do not beg for peace. We take what is ours by the strength of our arms and the grace of God." A murmur of approval ran through the ranks. The good knight felt a flicker of pride. Arnulf knew how to speak to warriors. "The ground ahead is treacherous," Arnulf continued. "The marsh will slow us. The Vikings will shoot at us from their walls. But we will not falter. We will advance, step by step, shield to shield, until we reach their palisade. And when we reach it, we will tear it down, and we will kill every man who stands against us." The murmur grew louder, a low growl of anticipation. "But we will not ride," Arnulf said, and the growl died. "We will fight on foot. Every man, from the Skara to the levies, will dismount. We will leave our horses with the grooms and advance as infantry. This is the only way to cross the marsh. This is the only way to victory." For a moment, there was stunned silence. The good knight could see the shock on the faces of the men around him. To dismount was to abandon the very thing that made them elite, the very thing that separated them from the common soldiers. But then, from somewhere in the ranks, a voice shouted, "For Arnulf!" And another voice took up the cry, and another, until the entire army was roaring, "For Arnulf! For Arnulf!" The good knight found himself shouting with them, his voice joining the chorus. The shock had passed, replaced by a fierce determination. If the king commanded them to fight on foot, they would fight on foot. And they would win. Arnulf raised his hand again, and the shouting died. "Dismount," he said, simply. The good knight turned and walked back to where the grooms were holding the horses. He found Ash and ran his hand along the destrier's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal's body, the steady rhythm of its breathing. "Stay safe," he murmured, though he knew the horse could not understand. Then he turned and walked back to the formation. The Skara were forming up in a dense phalanx, shields overlapping, spears bristling forward. The good knight took his place in the front rank, shoulder to shoulder with Hrathar on his left and Egbert on his right. Behind them, the levies were forming up in similar fashion, their ranks less disciplined but no less determined. The good knight adjusted his grip on his spear and settled his shield on his arm. The weight of his armor pressed down on his shoulders, and he could feel the mail rings shifting against the padded gambeson beneath. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, misting in the cold morning air. Arnulf rode to the front of the earth. Formation one last time. He drew his sword, a magnificent blade with a gold-inlaid hilt, and pointed it toward the Viking camp. "Forward!" he shouted. The phalanx began to move. The first steps were easy. The ground near the camp was relatively solid, and the formation moved smoothly, the men keeping their spacing, their shields locked together. The good knight could hear the rhythmic tramp of boots, the clink of mail, the creak of leather. But within 50 yards, the ground began to change. The earth grew softer, wetter. The good knight's boots sank into the mud with each step, and he had to pull hard to free them. The weight of his armor made every movement an effort. Around him, the other warriors were struggling as well, their breathing growing heavier, their pace slowing. The marsh was worse than he had imagined. The water was not just on the surface, it was everywhere, seeping up through the ground, filling every depression, turning the earth into a sucking morass. In places, the water was ankle-deep. In others, it reached his knees. The formation began to lose its cohesion. Men stumbled, fell, were hauled back to their feet by their comrades, the Tita. Shields, which had been locked together in a solid wall, began to separate as the warriors focused on keeping their footing. The good knight gritted his teeth and pushed forward. His legs burned with the effort, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The mail coat, which had felt like a second skin on solid ground, now felt like a leaden shroud, dragging him down with every step. And then the arrows began to fall. The first volley came without warning, a hiss of air, a thud of impact. The good knight raised his shield instinctively, and an arrow struck the wood with a sharp crack, the iron head punching through the leather covering but stopping short of his arm. Around him, other men were raising their shields as well, and the phalanx became a forest of wood and iron, a moving fortress. But the arrows kept coming. The Vikings on the ramparts were shooting in volleys, their bows sending a steady rain of death into the advancing Franks. Most of the arrows struck shields or glanced off, mail, but some found gaps, a throat, an eye, a thigh. Men cried out and fell, and the formation had to step over them or around them, leaving them behind in the mud. The good knight kept his shield high and his eyes on the palisade ahead. It was still 100 yards away, perhaps more. The distance seemed impossible, a vast expanse of mud and water and death. But he kept moving. Step, pull, step, pull. The rhythm became everything. He did not think about the arrows, did not think about the men falling around him. He thought only about the next step, the next yard of ground. Beside him, Hrothgar was breathing hard, his face red with effort. "This is madness," he gasped. "Keep moving," the good knight said. His voice was calm, almost detached. "We're almost there." It was a lie, but it was a necessary lie. They were not almost there. They were barely halfway. But if the men believed they were close, they would keep moving. Another volley of arrows fell. One struck the good knight's helmet with a ringing clang, and for a moment his vision went white with pain. He staggered, nearly fell, but Egbert grabbed his arm and steadied him. "You all right?" Egbert shouted over the din. The good knight nodded, though his head was spinning. He could feel blood trickling down the side of his face, warm and sticky. The arrow had not penetrated the helmet, but the impact had split the skin beneath. He kept moving. The marsh seemed endless. The good knight's legs were numb with cold and exhaustion, and his lungs burned with every breath. The weight of his armor was crushing, and he could feel his strength ebbing with every step. But the palisade was closer now. He could see the individual stakes, the gaps between them, the faces of the Vikings on the ramparts. They were shouting, jeering, hurling insults in their guttural tongue. Some were throwing spears, which arced through the air and thudded into shields, or splashed into the water. 50 yards, 40, 30. The good knight could see the ditch now, a dark line at the base of the rampart. It was deep, perhaps 6 feet, and filled with water. Beyond it, the earthen wall rose steeply, topped with the wooden palisade. 20 yards. The Vikings were no longer shooting arrows. They were waiting, their axes and swords ready, their faces grim. They knew what was coming. 10 yards. The good knight reached the edge of the ditch and stopped, his chest heaving. Around him, the other warriors were arriving, forming up along the edge, their shields raised. The levies were still struggling through the marsh behind them, but the Skara had made it. They had crossed the killing ground. Now came the hard part. The ditch was deeper than it had looked from a distance. The good knight peered over the edge and saw dark, murky water, perhaps waist deep, with a muddy bottom that would suck at boots and make climbing the far side nearly impossible. But there was no other way. Arnulf was there, standing at the edge of the ditch, his sword in his hand, his face set in a mask of determination. "Into the ditch!" he shouted. "Climb the wall! Break the palisade!" The good knight did not hesitate. He stepped off the edge and dropped into the water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The water came up to his chest, and the weight of his armor dragged him down. His feet sank into the mud at the bottom, and for a moment he thought he would be trapped, unable to move. But he forced himself forward, wading through the water toward the far side of the ditch. Around him, other warriors were doing the same, their faces twisted with effort. The Vikings were waiting. As the Franks reached the base of the rampart, the Northmen began to strike downward with spears and axes, trying to kill the attackers before they could climb. The The good knight raised his shield and felt a spear point scrape across the wood. He thrust upward with his own spear, aiming for the gap between the palisade stakes, and felt the blade bite into flesh. A scream, and the Viking fell back. The good knight dropped his spear. It was useless now, too long for close combat, and grabbed the edge of the rampart with both hands. The earth was slick and muddy, and his fingers slipped. He tried again, digging his fingers into the soil, and pulled himself upward. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. The weight of his armor was immense, and his arms shook with the effort, but he pulled, inch by inch, until his chest was level with the top of the rampart. He swung his leg up, hooked his boot over the edge, and hauled himself onto the narrow platform at the base of the palisade. A Viking was there, a huge man with a braided beard and a Dane axe. He swung the axe in a wide arc, aiming for the good knight's head. The good knight raised his shield, and the axe struck with a force that numbed his arm. The shield splintered, the wood cracking down the middle, but it held. The good knight dropped the ruined shield and drew his sword. The blade hissed free of the scabbard, and he lunged forward, driving the point into the Viking's belly. The man gasped, his eyes wide with shock, and fell backward. The good knight did not stop. He turned and grabbed one of the palisade stakes, pulling at it with all his strength. The wood was thick and deeply embedded, but the earth around it was soft from the rain. It shifted, just slightly. "Here!" he shouted. "Help me!" Ratha was beside him, and Egbert, and 2 other warriors. Together they pulled at the stake, their combined strength finally wrenching it free. The gap in the palisade was small, but it was enough. The good knight stepped through the gap and into the Viking camp. Inside the palisade, the world was chaos. The Vikings had formed a shield wall just behind the breach, a dense line of overlapping shields and bristling spears. But the Franks were pouring through the gap now, and the weight of their numbers was beginning to tell. The good knight found himself in the front rank of the Frankish assault, his sword in his hand, his body moving on instinct. He struck at the Viking shield wall, his blade clanging off iron bosses and wooden rims. Beside him, Ratha was swinging a captured axe, and Egbert was thrusting with a spear. The fighting was brutal and close. There was no room for finesse, no room for tactics. It was simply a matter of strength and endurance, of who could keep fighting longer. The good knight's sword found a gap in the Viking line, and he drove the blade forward, feeling it punch through mail and into flesh. The Viking fell, and the good knight stepped over him, pressing forward. The shield wall was breaking. The Vikings, for all their ferocity, could not hold against the disciplined assault of the Skara. They began to fall back, step by step, their line fragmenting. And then, suddenly, the line collapsed. The Vikings broke and ran, scattering in all directions. Some fled toward the longships, hoping to escape by water. Others ran toward the far side of the camp, where the river offered a slim chance of survival. The Franks pursued them, cutting them down as they ran. The good knight found himself chasing a Viking warrior toward the river, his legs burning with exhaustion, but his blood singing with the thrill of victory. The Viking reached the bank and plunged into the water, and the good knight stopped at the edge, his chest heaving. The river was full of Vikings. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, were trying to swim across, their arms flailing, their faces twisted with panic. But the current was strong, and the water was cold, and many of them were wearing armor. The good knight watched as men sank beneath the surface, dragged down by the weight of their mail. He watched as others were swept downstream, their screams fading into the distance. The water turned dark with blood and churned up mud, and the bodies began to pile up along the banks and in the shallows. It was a slaughter, not a battle, but a massacre. The good knight stood on the bank, his sword hanging loose in his hand, and felt a becalm wave of nausea wash over him. He had killed men before, many men, but he had never seen anything like this. The sheer scale of the death, the industrial efficiency of it, was overwhelming. Behind him, the Frankish warriors were looting the camp, pulling silver and weapons and furs from the Viking tents. Arnulf was there, his sword red with blood, his face grim but satisfied. The king had won his victory. But the good knight could not feel satisfaction. He could only feel the weight of what he had witnessed, the horror of the river choked with corpses. He turned away from the water and walked back into the camp, his legs unsteady, his mind numb. Chapter 7. The aftermath. The sun was high in the sky by the time the killing stopped. The Frankish army had taken the camp, and the Vikings were dead or fled. The longships had been burned, the treasure divided, the standards captured. The good knight sat on a fallen log near the center of the camp, his armor still on, his sword across his knees. His face was streaked with blood and mud, and his hands were shaking. He could not stop them. Rather approached, carrying a wineskin. He sat down beside the good knight and offered the skin. The good knight took it and drank deeply, the wine burning his throat. "You fought well," Ratha said. The good knight did not reply. He was staring at the ground, at the trampled mud and the dark stains that marked where men had died. "The king is pleased," Ratha continued. "He's granting land to the Skara. You'll be a rich man." The good knight nodded slowly. Rich. Yes, he would be rich. He would have silver and land and honor. But he would also have the memory of the river, of the bodies piled so thick they blocked the flow of the water. He looked up at Ratha. "How many did we lose?" Ratha shrugged. "A dozen, maybe. Most of them in the marsh. The Vikings barely touched us once we breached the wall." A dozen. Against thousands. It was a victory beyond measure, but it did not feel like victory. The good knight stood, his legs stiff and sore. He sheathed his sword and walked toward the edge of the camp, where the grooms were holding the horses. He found Ash and ran his hand along the destrier's neck, feeling the warmth and solidity of the animal. "We're going home," he murmured. But even as he said it, he knew it was not true. He would return to his estate, to his wife, to his life. But a part of him would remain here, on the banks of the Dyle, standing in the mud and blood, and watching the river run black with death. He mounted Ash and turned the horse toward the east, toward home. Behind him, the Frankish army was celebrating, their voices rising in songs of victory. But the good knight did not sing. He rode in silence, his eyes on the horizon, his mind on the river. He had survived. He had won. But he was not the same man who had ridden into the valley 3 days ago. He was bloodied. He was shaken. And he would carry the weight of this day for the rest of his life. Epilogue. The legacy. In the weeks that followed, King Arnulf ordered the construction of a fortress on the site of the Viking camp. It was built on the high ground where the Northmen had made their stand, and it was called the Kaisersberg, the Emperor's Mountain. The fortress would become the heart of a new city, a city that would grow and prosper in the centuries to come. Leuven. The good knight was granted a benefice in the land surrounding the new fortress, a reward for his service in the battle. He built a manor house on a hill overlooking the Dyle, and he lived there for many years, watching the river flow past, remembering the day when it had run black with blood. He never spoke of the battle, not to his wife, not to his children. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would walk down to the riverbank and stand in the place where the Vikings had died. And he would remember. The river was clear now, its waters sparkling in the sunlight. The bodies were long gone, washed downstream, or buried in the mud. But the good knight could still see them, could still hear their screams, could still feel the weight of his sword in his hand. He had survived the Battle of the Dyle. He had won glory and silver and land. but he had also learned that victory has a cost, and that cost is measured not in gold, but in the weight of memory, in the burden of the things we cannot forget. The good knight stood on the bank of the Dyle, his silver armor glinting in the fading light, and he knew that he would carry this burden until the day he died, and beyond.